as you know, his skin color is a little darker, and you over there might be, if you were in Canada, you might be worried in certain places, because there's, you know, getting into the States would be difficult because, but most of us here are white. We're talking about the 42 days, and we're not the ones who are going to be in jail. And so it's got a nice academic kind of feel. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, there's risk. And Romans was written to a community, that was at the receiving end of the violence. And Paul is saying to the, particularly I think in Romans 8, to the Christians, look, those who are suffering are the ones who are on the right side of the story. And those of us who aren't suffering need to be entering into that suffering situation. So maybe I think your Muslim friend is exactly right. I don't think he should go near a protest like that. I mean, he'd be in Canada or the U.S., he'd be a marked man. But Christians then need to be, those of us who have some kind of power, which we do, need to be raising our voices, because face it, even though we're Christians, we're not at risk for anything like that. I mean, the press may make fun of us, but we're not at any kind of that kind of risk. We need to be raising our voices and talking about the injustice that people are experiencing, whether they're Muslim or Christian or Jews or whoever, just because of their ethnic background. This is the whole problem in Romans. You can't, just because somebody's Jewish doesn't mean you can exclude them. And the whole Gospels are about that again and again. No barbarian or Scythian, no Greek or Jew, those ethnic differences, Pentecost, all these languages, you can understand them. What's that saying except these ethnic barriers don't matter anymore? And as Christians, we haven't been there at the forefront of saying, we cannot just vilify a people because of what they look like, or how they talk, or the fact that they're from Pakistan. We can't do that. That wasn't a practical answer, but a more general answer.
I don't think we shall ever get agreement as to the reality of the terrorist threat, so I don't want to pursue that argument. I would like to go to the principle, the idea that returning evil with good ultimately wins because good wins out. I just want to question the consequences of that. The Dutch resistance might well have properly decided that acts of violence against Nazi Germany were counterproductive, but ultimately Holland was freed from Nazi occupation because the Americans decided, ultimately they were pushed into the decision that they had to defeat Japanese and German military might militarily. It is true that evil regimes ultimately break apart, but in the process millions of people die and millions of people suffer. And it used to be said in Whig terms that for evil to prosper, good men only have to do nothing. I just wonder whether we should examine the reality of turning the other cheek in every circumstance.
I'd like to just give a quick response to that. Because I don't think we're going to resolve this anymore. We're going to resolve the 42 days issue. I do think that the onus for Christians on this debate, the onus is not, I think, on those who are going to push for a more pacifist position to justify that position, so much as the onus is on those who want to find a way to justify returning evil with evil, to do so. The text is clear. The text is very uncomfortably clear. And when Sylvia first preached on this in our Christian Reformed church, our Dutch community church in small town Ontario, one of the older men came up to me and he said, and I was preaching in the evening, "Are you going to be as good as your wife tonight?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And I started the evening service by saying, I'm not going to be as good as Sylvia tonight, but let's talk about that sermon. What's the problem with that sermon? Hands up all over the place. And the answers were, it's impractical, it's unrealistic, it can't be lived, it goes against the grain. Nobody said it's unbiblical. And I think that what we have to struggle with here is we have to struggle with, if this is Paul's vision, and this is the vision clearly rooted in Jesus, then can we begin to have an alternative imagination about how we as a Christian community respond to violence? Can we find an alternative imagination that actually responds to violence with good and with generosity? Can we do that?
And let me add to that. I think we sometimes think that when Paul was writing or when Jesus said things like love your enemies or turn the other cheek, that the situation wasn't as bad as, say, Nazi Germany. But it was. I mean, what the Romans were doing was sometimes they crucified 500 people at a time on crosses outside of town. I mean, just look at the trial of Jesus. I mean, within less than 24 hours, he was hanging on a cross from having been hauled away. This is Roman justice. Never mind waiting for 42 days and gathering evidence and all. I mean, the guy who ordered him to be crucified admitted he was innocent. It was incredibly horrific living under Rome. And yet you had Jesus saying, love your enemies and turn the other cheek. Blessed are the peacemakers. You had Paul saying these things. Why in that context did they think this is a viable option?
And let's also note that when Judea finally erupted in the late 60s, and there was then this revolt against Rome, there is no evidence whatsoever that Christian Jews in Judea joined that resistance. There is no evidence. It seems that they did not participate. This was not the way of Jesus.
And I'd like to add, too, I mean, you commented about, oppression ascending only if good people do nothing. We're not saying that. Paul is talking about communities that are doing things radically differently, things that have radical implications for the lifestyles, not just participating in what's going on in their culture. So it's not doing nothing or fighting. There's another option there. Okay, David.
Yeah, it's still connected. I'm not a scholar or know anything about history, and I certainly don't have a soapbox, but it's just something that occurred to me. And I wonder if there is a different mandate from God on a national level and to governments, because I might be reading this wrong, but it says in Romans 13 about authorities in verse 4, for he is God's servant to do you good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He, I suppose that's the authority, he is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And I think I was thinking just in terms of Hitler, which is very high profile and obvious, that evil really had to be stopped, and that perhaps God's mandate to governments is to, in some cases.
Except that what happens in the Third Reich is that you have Lutheran church leaders quoting Romans 13 to justify obedience to the Führer. Right? How's that going to work?
This is our plan to keep David fit.
Yes. If somebody over there would raise their hands, we could make David run the other way. That would be good. He had much too much for dinner last night.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways that people can respond in different situations. But we also remember in Germany, we also had the confessional church who got together and rebelled against Hitler. And there's lots of different ways of rebelling against people. Also in Holland, the Dutch people refused to hand over, or what you call it, the Jews to the Germans.